Well, that was macabre. I said to Jess, "So you're up for the reading?" She went, "Yeah, it's pretty intense." Hello, everybody. I'm Denise, if you haven't met me. Looking forward to getting to know you over a cuppa afterwards, if you don't know me already. Who's ever heard of this passage? Is this quite familiar? Yes, lots of people have heard it. Damn bones, gonna walk around. It's been in my head all week, actually. I've been having a lot of difficulty getting that song out of my head. My husband is also sick of it. It is a very disturbing and weirdly graphic passage, isn't it? It's like something out of one of those zombie horror movies that Jake is so fond of. If you're a friend of Jake's on Facebook, he's always talking about these wacky zombie movies. There's bones rattling in this passage. There's skeletons dancing. There's corpses coming back to life. This vision that Ezekiel recounts has all this weird stuff in it. Well, if you were here 2 weeks ago, you might remember me talking about the Spirit with the uppercase S and the Spirit with the lowercase s, and how sometimes it's hard for English translators of the Bible to figure out which one it should be. Should they write it with an uppercase or a lowercase? And we also found out that the Hebrew word ruach, which is sometimes translated as spirit in our English translations, can also be translated with the words breath or wind. And translators choose which English word to use based solely on context. So, did the Spirit of God hover over the waters in Genesis 1:2? Or was it the breath of God? Or was it a wind from God? Well, yes, because in the ancient Hebrew mind, there's really not that much different between the three. For the ancient Hebrew, spirit, breath, and wind, they weren't three different concepts. They were more like three aspects to one idea. So there's this idea that God infuses the world with his life-giving spirit, so that when you see a branch moving in the wind, or you feel the air moving in and out of your lungs, it's proof that the presence and the power of God that created and sustains the universe, it's proof that that exists. So God's spirit, breath, wind, God's ruach, animates the world and everything in it. It's like the life force of the universe. So that was a couple of weeks ago. Last week, if you're here, you'll remember we looked at one practical application of the idea that God's Spirit is involved in all of life and can actually be found, like the Spirit can actually be found outside of Pentecostal worship services. I'm not sure if you are aware of that. So we talked about St. Ignatius of Loyola, and he was particularly convinced that God could be found in all of life, even in the boring bits. And he came up with this practical way of discerning the Spirit's work in our everyday lives. He reasoned that if God's Spirit is a life-giving Spirit, something that animates and enlivens things, then we could review our day at the end of our day and ask, what brought me life today? And what stifled or diminished life today? And the answers to those questions, particularly if we ask them on a regular basis, might help us to discern where God is in our lives and what God is up to in our lives. And he called that process of reviewing our day the examine. Anyone try it this week?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Yep. It's interesting. I even got a couple of texts from people, and I think the small groups had a bit of a chat about some of this stuff. Anyway, all of that, uppercase spirit, lowercase spirit, and this whole idea that God can be found in everything, all of that is going to help us with Ezekiel's zombie horror movie tonight. So Ezekiel, the prophet, he's living as an exile, far, far away from his home. And he describes this vision that he has from God, and that's the vision that you heard. Ezekiel uses the word ruach, that spirit, wind, breath, 10 times in the 14 verses that you heard Jess read. So every time you heard wind or breath or spirit in that passage, the Hebrew word is the same word. It's ruach. It gets translated with different words in the same passage, but it's the same Hebrew word. And I feel like there's something here for us if we want to understand more about God's Spirit and how it brings life. So, let me give you a little bit of behind the text information. So Ezekiel's this prophet. He lived around 600 BC, long time ago. It was a time when Israel, Ezekiel's home country, was a pawn in a fight between two major powers. There was Egypt to the south and Babylon further north. And Israel chose to side with Egypt. They had to pick a side. They picked Egypt, and that turned out to be a mistake. Babylon came in, invaded Israel, rounded up all the community leaders, anybody who had any influence, and took them all back to Babylon so they couldn't cause any trouble. If you've got a bunch of people with all the leaders gone, then it's a bit hard to organise into a resistance movement, isn't it? So that's the strategy, just take all the leaders away. Ezekiel was one of those leaders. And from his place in exile in Babylon, Ezekiel is given prophecies to share both with his fellow Israelites in exile, but also those back in Jerusalem. Now, at the beginning of this exile, those with Ezekiel in Babylon, they figured, this is going to be a short-term thing. Short-term interruption. The political situation will settle down and we'll be allowed to return from exile and we'll be able to go back home, back to Jerusalem, back to where the temple was, the all-important temple. You see, the people who were left in Jerusalem, they could keep on bringing their offerings to God. And they brought them to the temple and sacrifices like they had done for centuries. It's a central part of life. And the exiles, they hoped that, they could be reunited with those in Jerusalem soon, and they looked forward to resuming their lives and resuming their worship rituals and offerings like they'd done before. But that was not to be. 10 years after that first exile, the Babylonians returned to Jerusalem, and this time they just razed it to the ground, totally destroyed it. The walls around Jerusalem were destroyed, homes were decimated, more of the population were taken into exile, and most devastating of all, the temple was completely destroyed. There was nothing left of it. It's kind of hard for us to imagine the significance of this because our church buildings don't really hold the same significance as a temple. The temple is the dwelling place of God. It's a place where people meet with God. It's a holy place. It's a sacred place. It's where you went to, you bought your Passover lamb to be slaughtered in the temple so that you could take it home and have roast lamb for your Passover. You can't take it anywhere else. You have to take it to the temple. So if the temple's gone, well, you can't really have a Passover unless you're going to have a vegan Passover, which is not quite the point. The temple is the place where where there was a sacrifice made twice every day to atone for the sins of the people. What's going to happen if there's no temple? How do our sins get atoned for? So the temple's the centre of all of the annual festivals. So without a temple, it's really hard to imagine how do you stay connected with God? How do you live out your faith without a temple? If the temple's gone, the dwelling place of God is gone, God must surely have abandoned us. So the absence of a temple meant the absence of God. So this exile, now everything's destroyed back in Jerusalem, It's not going to be just a small interruption, a little temporary setback. Exile is death. It's spiritual death. The exiles felt cut off by God. They felt abandoned by God. They felt cut off from their spiritual roots. They had no spiritual home to return to. It was gone. There's no hope, no future. And the very foundation of their spiritual lives had been shaken. And everything that they'd built on that foundation had come tumbling down. And I'm wondering if there are people here who can relate a little bit to that experience, that feeling of being cut off from God, exiled, unable to return to their spiritual home, to their spiritual roots. Maybe you feel, or maybe you've felt at some point in the past, that your whole spiritual foundation has been shaken and everything is in danger of tumbling down. Maybe you wonder about the future. Maybe you wonder about the future of your faith, of your connection to God, of your identity within the people of God. Maybe you felt that sense of hopelessness, that inability to return to where you were before. And now you're kind of in no man's land. Maybe you're unsure of who you are or where your place is now. Maybe you feel like an exile. Because as I've talked to people in this congregation over the last couple of years, that idea of being an exile is kind of a recurring theme. And I feel sad about that, and I also feel angry about that. If you feel like an exile, or if you've felt like an exile in the past, then I think there's a message in this passage for you. So, let's have a little closer look. Are we good with me? Okay. So Ezekiel's taken to this valley floor, and the ground is littered with bones. They're human bones, and there's so many of them. As far as the eye can see, there are bones. These bones are old and they're dry. They're bleached by the sun that's been beating down on them for decades, maybe centuries. There's been an enormous battle here, but it's an ancient, long forgotten battle in the past. And Ezekiel walks around amidst the bones in this valley that's just devoid of life. There is no life here. And you can almost feel the silence of the scene. It must have been a terrible battle, because these ancient human remains, they were never collected, never identified, never given a proper burial by relatives or friends. They were just left to rot. They were abandoned a long, long time ago. And God says to Ezekiel, "Can these bones live?" And Ezekiel goes, "And then God said to me, prophesy over these bones and tell them, dry bones, listen to the Lord's message. This is what the sovereign Lord says to these bones. Look, I'm about to infuse breath, ruach, into you, and you will live. I'll put tendons on you and muscles over you and cover you with skin. I will put breath in you, and you will live. And then you will know that I am the Lord." Ezekiel is told to talk to the bones, not the hand, the bones. Talk to the bones. To tell them that there's hope. That God is about to bring life where there hasn't been life for a really long time. God's about to put his breath, his ruach, into them. And so Ezekiel does what God has instructed him to do. And immediately, Ezekiel becomes aware of a noise. It's a rattling. It spreads across the valley. There's movement. There's action. Things are happening. Across this whole vast valley, bones are starting to shake. They're quivering. They're vibrating. And then they start moving towards one another, clattering together. And as Ezekiel continues to watch, tendons start forming among them, between them, joining them together. And muscles grow over them, warm and smooth and healthy looking pink. This is a reversal of the body's decomposition. Lastly, skin begins to cover these exposed tendons and muscles. And suddenly the valley is filled not with dry bones, but with bodies of flesh and blood. But there's still something missing. These are bodies without breath. The bodies don't have air coursing through their lungs. They're bodies without ruach, without spirit, the thing that makes a body a living being, the spark of life that animates. Can you hear echoes of the Eden story here? God fashions a body out of the ground, but it's not alive until God breathes into that dirt body's nostrils. God then tells Ezekiel to speak to the ruach. He's spoken to the bones, now he's got to speak to the ruach. He's got to speak to the breath that God has breathed into all of creation. This ruach that makes creation alive with bird song and with green leaves in springtime and with branches swaying in the breeze and the warmth of the sun shining and the waves crashing up on the sand and then running back out into the sea. That ruach that animates the universe. Ezekiel is to say to the ruach, come from the four winds. That's ruach. O breath, ruach. And breathe on these slain bodies that they may live. And so Ezekiel does what God's instructed him to do, and this ruach, God's life force that infuses creation from the north to the south, from the east to the west, this ruach comes from all four directions and it blows over the bodies and breathes on them. And they begin to live. And they stand up on their feet. And as far as the eye can see, the dry bones have become living, breathing people who can stand and walk and live. Now, for Ezekiel's generation, those who were stuck in exile in a foreign land, this vision, can you see how it would bring hope? It was a promise that God was going to bring the exiles back to their home, that they still had a future, that God had not abandoned them, that they wouldn't stay as dry bones with no life and no future. But you know, this passage has brought hope not just to Ezekiel's generation, but to hundreds of generations since. And these words in this passage are for anyone who says, our bones are dry, our hope has perished, and we are cut off. If you look at your life and you feel like you're seeing a valley of dry bones, don't despair. God brings life to valleys of dry bones, even bones that have been lying dry and bleached for the longest time. God can bring the bones back together, starting with a soft rattle, some small, almost imperceptible movements. Maybe you can just discern those small movements when you practice the examine. If you feel like your life is a valley of dry bones, try practicing that examine. Review each part of your day and ask, what brought me life today? And maybe you'll discern some of that movement. Oh, let's go back. So, maybe the bones aren't dry. If you feel you have no hope, that your hope has perished, just hang on for a little while longer, because there is hope, even if you don't feel it right now. And that hope, it's stronger and it's more persistent than you could ever imagine, because God's life-giving breath, spirit, wind, ruach, it's present in every corner of the world, from north to south, from east to west. Spring always follows winter. New shoots grow from the stumps of fallen trees. Life is very, very persistent. God is in all things. God is found in all life. And there are a lot of people in this congregation who can testify to that, who have found hope in hopeless circumstances, who've gone through hard times and come out the other side. And you can too. Maybe you feel cut off, separated from the rest of the human race, out there on your own. Maybe you feel exiled, alone, far from home, thinking, well, no one could love you. No one would want you. You are incorrect. Nothing can separate us, cut us off from the love of God, not the heights of elation or the depths of despair. If you feel cut off from God's people, feeling like you don't belong, maybe you've been rejected from another church, either overtly or more subtly, maybe you've been given the impression that you are something wrong, then I pray that you might find a home here at MCC, because lots of exiles have found a home here. And like any home, we're not all sweetness and light. We've got our flaws and our dysfunction and our occasional conflicts. But join us anyway. Make yourself at home. There is a place for you. There's a place for everyone here. If you're at a time in your life where you feel numb or dead or no spark of life, listen to these final words that God gave to Ezekiel to share with those whose bones are dry, whose hope is perished, and who feel cut off from their people and from their God. This is what God said. Therefore prophesy and tell them, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Look, I'm about to open your graves and will raise you from your graves, my people. I will bring you to your homeland. Then you will know that I am the Lord when I open your graves and raise you from your graves, my people. I place my ruach in you, and you will live, and I will give you rest in your homeland. Encouraging words tonight.